This is the third of what is shaping up to be an amazing series of online events. Who would have thought a year ago that we would be doing everything by video? But I'm Liza Bernard from the Norwich Bookstore, but obviously hosting from home. While the bookstore does remain closed for browsing, we are definitely open for orders and talking about books and packing up books to be picked up from the porch, or we ship them out to people all over the country, and we're happy to be doing that. We're working on an opening plan, but we're nowhere near yet. But one of the quick store update is that we launched today our pop-up porch shop. And weather permitting, we have a nice selection of cards and gift wrap and other little treasures on the porch for you to browse. And that's sort of our interim way to address the fact that people can't come in the store. We miss you all, but we're still working with you. So for tonight's event, I'm going to ask you to keep your video off and the audio mute. And visually, it's very helpful if you select the speaker option on your screens. The presenter or whoever's talking is front and center, which will be Stephen most of the time. Then turn on the chat, and you'll see links to the books, and you can add your questions and comments, and there'll be some interaction that I will be the interpreter between the author and the audience. We will be recording this event to post to the website later on, just so you know. And the format, brief introduction, and then Stephen Kiernan will have the stage to talk about his new book, The Universe of Two. It went on sale on Tuesday. I happened to get to read it months ago, and it's fabulous. After he presents his book, I'll hop back on to share your questions and comments. And I do want to thank Michael Prowse, who's our virtual assistant working in the background to make sure everything's running smoothly. So I have to say, it's really exciting to welcome Stephen Kiernan back to Norwich, albeit virtually. I think this may be the fourth talk for 2 or 3 books, because he's spoken to the Norwich Women's Club. He's come to town for other events. We always love having you here in whatever format. So Stephen currently lives on the other side of Vermont with his family. He was born in Newtonville, New York, the 6th of 7 children. You got me beat by 1. And he is a graduate of Middlebury College. He received a Master of Arts degree from Johns Hopkins University and a Master of Fine Arts degree from the University of Iowa Writers Workshop. He's chaired the board of the Young Writers Project and has been very involved in palliative care issues. Universe of Two is Stephen's 6th book and 4th novel. His nonfiction books came first, I believe, and they are The Last Rites and Authentic Patriotism. And he's spoken to us about his earlier novels, The Curiosity, which I've just learned is now in television series development, which is very interesting, and The Baker's Secret, which is a regional indie bestseller, and The Hummingbird. So 75 years ago today, Hiroshima was the first city targeted by a nuclear weapon when the US dropped the atomic bomb, known as Little Boy. Most of the city was destroyed, and by the end of the year, 90,000 to 166,000 had died as a result of the blast and its effects. Universe of Two talks about the development of the bomb and the aftermath on a number of different people. About the Universe of Two, a reviewer for Booklist wrote, quote, Kiernan recreates the zeitgeist of America leading up to the atomic bomb on a national and personal level. The eager anticipation of wartime's end, the grimly fascinating science, and the growing sense of guilt and dread. Simultaneously tender and hard-hitting, this riveting story offers much to reflect upon, and I couldn't have said it better. So I hope you enjoy this evening. Stephen?
Thank you, Liza. Thank you so much for having me with you, and thanks to everyone who's joining us tonight. I've been fortunate, yes, to have made a presentation for each of my novels at the Norwich Bookstore, and I wish I were there right now. And among other things, it means I'm not going to be able to walk up to the inn and have a beer after I'm done. But I've also been down to speak with the Women's Lunch Group a couple of times, which has been terrific. And so I'm delighted to see a full screen of names. Some I recognize and some I haven't met before. And, um, and I'm very happy to be talking to you about Universe of Two. Um, they say don't judge a book by its cover. But I want to hold this cover up for one reason.
Mhm.
What you see there is a love story cover. And this book is about the time of the development of the atomic bomb. And I'll talk about the bomb a fair amount. But this is at the core of it. It is the love between a man and a woman that is the core of this novel. The woman is Brenda. Brenda is a sassy, kind of sharp tongued, a little bit egotistical Chicago girl. She's 19 years old in 1943. She's a gifted musician, piano and organ primarily. And she was accepted to the Oberlin Conservatory to study music, but her family could not afford to send her to college, particularly during wartime. So she's working in the family business, which is a piano and organ store in Hyde Park, Chicago. And she's dating a lot of soldiers and sailors, and she gives them all a kiss goodnight, but no more than that, because she doesn't want them to think she's fast. But she figures, why not give them a smooch and they'll have something to think about while they go off to do the world's worst job. One day at work, a young man walks in, and he is unimpressive. He's skinny and shy and overly formal and a little bit younger than her, and his name is Charlie. It turns out Charlie is doing math for the Department of War. He doesn't even know exactly what the math is for. There's some people in his unit who are figuring out how to feed a battalion or how to fuel a flotilla. He's doing this very esoteric kind of math, and turns out he's good at it, but it's very complicated. And um, and he has certain kinds of strength of character that Brenda begins to realize is maybe a little more substantial than the guys that she's been dating so far. Now, the reason that Charlie's interested in her is that even though she's full of sass and has a pretty high opinion of herself, when she plays, she's beautiful, especially when she plays slow songs. So he's always asking her to play slow songs. She doesn't know that she's beautiful, which is part of what makes it even better for him. So they have one of the first dates of the century. I may talk about that later. Great first date. And romance begins between them, whereupon he is promoted because he's been good at this math. He is promoted to Los Alamos, New Mexico, where he finds out the name of the thing that he's been working on, which is called the Manhattan Project. And he's been there for a number of months before he finds out that what they're actually doing is building the strongest weapon that's ever been created. And he's going to be building the detonator, the thing that's the spark that lights the fuse that starts the whole thing happening. And he's got a lot of moral misgivings about it. He's a choir boy and a mathematician, and now he's 19 and 20 years old. He's not ready for those sorts of moral questions, and he's hesitant. And when he comes to Brenda and shares those qualms that he has, she's not allowed to know what he's working on for security reasons. So she just says, "Hey, soldier up, my brother's over in Europe. And my best friend's husband, he's about to be part of the invasion in Japan where a million Americans are expected to die. Be a man." So he does his job, and the bomb does its job. And after the war, he feels a burden of guilt and responsibility for what he did and what he participated in. Not that he shouldn't have done it, but he still feels that afterward. And Brenda, now that she knows what she was urging him to do, she feels some culpability too. And so the two of them together set out to spend the rest of their lives finding redemption with their love for one another as their foundation and their guide. So that's the story of the Baker's Secret. And I'm sorry, excuse me, of Universe of Two. And it's been out for 2 whole days, and it was timed to be in conjunction with the anniversary today, 75th anniversary of Hiroshima. And that's the story. So what I'd love to do is chat with you all about things you might want to know about the book, things that are interesting to you, your opinions about the atomic bomb, and so on. And I may do a little slideshow a little later, and I may play some question games for you. But in the meantime, you can ask me anything, by which I mean you can ask me anything. So go for it. If you have a question, don't be shy. Any volunteers?
Not yet.
Okay, well then I'm going to suggest that we do this instead. There are 21 of you, so let's see how well we do at this game. I'm going to give you two options for little quick things. I learned a bunch of really cool stuff about atomic power and atomic weapons that do not appear in the book, or only in a little bit in the book, but they're kind of cool to know. So I'm going to give you two choices, and you pick one. Okay? So I've got four of these. So we'll see how we do. So the first one is, do you want to hear about the plane, or do you want to hear about the screwdriver? So if you would just please vote on chat, plane or screwdriver. These are going to be about 1 minute each, 2 minutes each, these four things. See how we do.
Plane, screwdriver, screwdriver.
Okay. Do the screwdrivers have it?
4 screwdrivers.
4
So far, the
screwdrivers.
screwdrivers have
Okay,
it.
now we're getting it. Now we're voting. All right. Great.
Well, it looks like the screwdrivers have it.
Screwdrivers have it. Too bad about the plane. Okay.
We can always go back to that.
That's true. So it works like this. Thank you for participating. So when you have something that is unstable, when you have an atom that is unstable, that could be split, and when you split it, you get that little pop of energy. That's what atomic power comes from, whatever form it takes, weapon or plant or nuclear attack submarine. You're splitting atoms, and when you get like one atom by itself and it splits, just the two parts kind of go off in a distance. If you get 10 of them together, one of them may hit one of the others when it splits, and then they'll split, and you get kind of a chain reaction. And so what you do when you have these metals like plutonium or uranium is try not to have too much of it in the same place at one time, so that it doesn't just start getting busy. It's like a high school dance. They all get busy. So there was a day that one group was working, and they had 2 containers of plutonium, about a half a thimble full each. And they were in these thick lead containers sitting on top of each other with a screwdriver between them to keep them from getting too close together and getting busy, right? So a man is walking by in the lab, and his thigh brushes the screwdriver, and it falls on the floor. And the man next to him picks up the screwdriver. When it falls to the floor, the 2 pieces of metal come together. And the man who's standing there picks up the other piece of metal and puts the screwdriver back in. And in that amount of time, the radioactivity was released, and in 6 weeks, everyone in that building had cancer. Like that strong. It's that strong. Okay, 2 more. The next 2. The first option is youngsters, and the second one is $1.50 and a case of beer. Who goes for youngsters? And who votes for $1.50 and a case of beer?
Youngsters, youngsters, youngsters. Beer.
You know, I'm glad that there's somebody who's with me on the beer there. What do you think?
Yeah. Takes longer to type $1.50.
It does. If you just want to put $1.50, put $1.50 or youngster.
Well, youngsters have it so far.
Youngsters have it?
Yep.
Okay, looks like youngsters win. So it works like this. The average age at Los Alamos, the team that built the atomic bomb, the average age was 27. They called Oppenheimer, Robert Oppenheimer, who ran the whole thing, they called him the old man. He was 39. And here's how it worked. One of the very senior people, it was the recruiting. One of the very senior people at the Manhattan Project, maybe Oppenheimer, maybe Szilard, one of the very senior people would go to a university, to the School of Mines at Columbia, or to the chemistry department at Berkeley, or the math department at Princeton, and recruit a professor and say, you're needed for a part of the war effort that's top secret. I can't tell you where you're going to go, but we need you to pack up your family and come with us and work on this, and it's going to make your whole career. And these scientists would say, okay. And then so that they would have a lab staff and people to work with them and to do their experiments, they would bring every grad student in their department with them. And so the result is that everybody was young. And a lot of these people didn't know what they were getting into. They literally didn't know what state they were going to. They didn't know what their address would be. They didn't know what kind of house they would live in. They didn't know if there'd be a school for their kids. All those sorts of questions. They just went because that was the war effort at the time. But the result is that a lot of the people that were doing this incredibly morally weighted work were, 24, 23, 22. And their bosses might be in their 40s, and so that would bring the average. But they were youngsters. The thing was built by youngsters. Okay, next one. We have two choices. We have, and then we'll get to the questions. I see people putting in questions, so maybe I'll save my last ones. But I'll do this one. Squash court or tower of power? You can put squash or tower. We got some tower. We got some squash. Oh, this one's really close. What do we think? Tower or squash?
I think it's even. Maybe you have to do one now and one later.
Okay. Last chance for anyone who wants to tip the scale. All right, tower. Just a way to understand the power of the atomic bomb. When they built the bomb for the first one, which was used in a test in Alamogordo, New Mexico, middle of nowhere in White Sands National Monument, really, really middle of nowhere, sand, desert, that kind of thing. They wanted to be able to observe the bomb, and so they also wanted it to blow it not just up in the air, but kind of in a circular way. So they built a steel tower, 100 feet tall, and they put a crane on the top, and they cranked the thing up to the top of the tower. And then they set, about 20 hours later, they set the bomb off. And when they did, the steel of the tower was vaporized. And for about 500 yards around in a circle, the sand was turned into beautiful green glass. And it was a crystal that had not existed on Earth before, and so they named it Trinitite after the Trinity test. And this glass is very pretty, and it is also very radioactive. And people used to go out there collecting souvenirs, and now it's against the law to pick up a piece of that glass because it's radioactive enough. You shouldn't be carrying it around. Just some of the fun facts that show about how much power there is. Do we have some questions from folks now?
It seemed like one question that was asked two different ways, and it's a really good question, is what was the germ of the idea, the characters or the history? And the other one asked, what drew you to writing this book? Was it the topic or was it the couple? Which I think is a different way of asking the same question.
Yes. Well, one is, I guess both those questions have two components. One is my interest and the other is the outcome. And I'll say this, I wrote a novel called The Hummingbird, which had what I thought was going to be a very small subplot about a Japanese pilot. And it ended up to me being kind of the most meaningful part of the book. I really loved that part of the book. And so that was sort of the Pacific Theater of World War II. And I learned a bunch. And then I wrote The Baker's Secret. The Baker's Secret was D-Day told from the French perspective. What it's like to live in occupied Normandy and think you're never going to be free again. And then 200,000 people show up and lay their lives down by the thousands for your liberation. What would that feel like? And that whole experience feel like? So that was a European theater. So I thought, well, if I've done those two components of the war, I would really like to write a home front story. And I was working on a novel that was not going very well. And I had been looking around for a good home front story. And I ran across one in an essay in the Georgia Review. And it was about a man who had worked he was a young mathematician, Harvard trained, and he had worked in Los Alamos in the detonator division. And not clear what he had done, but there were things that were interesting, like their driver's license had no address. It just said U.S. Army on it. And there were just things that were quirky about it, made me kind of interested. And I read on, and it turns out at the end of the war, this guy's detonator worked, succeeded, and so he was offered a full ride to Stanford to get a PhD in physics. And he got there, and all anyone was talking about was the bomb and bigger bombs and stronger bombs, maybe creating the hydrogen bomb. And he quit. He quit after about 8 weeks, said, I can't do this anymore. And instead, he went off and did a certain kind of work that I don't want to tell because it'll be a spoiler for the novel. But he turned in a very different direction away from his weaponry work and from physics. He left that all behind. And that to me was the germ, exactly as the questioner said it, a germ for an idea. And at first I thought I would write a novel based on that guy. And then it turned out that there was very little public record about him. And he does have a biographer who's worked for years to learn things about him, and I didn't want to compete with that. And I met her. I read what she had written, and I met her, and I met this man's daughter, and I interviewed her, and I said, no, it's not his story, but it's a story about a young person and who's in this predicament. And then I thought, I guess there were two things. One was that in The Baker's Secret, I had not been able to have a love element, very much of a love element in the story, and I wanted to have that in this particular story, maybe this time in my life. But also, I felt like a war story. There would be desire, even if it was separation that was a part of it. And I also thought if you have somebody working on the Manhattan Project, it's very important to have a central character who is not, because that's us. We don't know what nuclear weapons development is going on now. We don't know even where our nuclear attack submarines are. We don't know where our silos are. We know we have thousands more nuclear weapons than we need, but we don't know where they are or where they're aimed or any of that. So imagine if your loved one, if your spouse couldn't tell you what they were doing all day, and you're like, why do you complain about work? It'd be toughen up. And it turns out that what they're doing is something that's consequential. So that was what led me to the idea of this couple. And then I started writing them, and I fell in love with both of them. Once you start writing characters and they come to life, they become increasingly interesting. So then it was about the couple. And I realized I didn't want to write about the bomb. I was reading these amazing books about the bomb, and they were all for people who wanted to read a book of science and politics and military stuff. That's not me. I want to write about the heart of it. I want to write about what it was like as these people lived. So I'll give you one example, tiny example. I just gave you like all those interesting facts about the power of the bomb. Here's one more. That's the kind of thing I really love. At Los Alamos, arguably you had the greatest concentration of scientific minds ever in human history. A dozen Nobel Prize winners, department chairs in chemistry and physics and math and metallurgy and mining from all over the country, really all over the world, and all working on this project in the most sophisticated labs they could build. And yet, all the time at Los Alamos, the milk was sour. With all their brilliance, they could not come up with a reliable refrigeration method to get milk that was good in Santa Fe up the hill to Los Alamos and refrigerated overnight, even one night. And people would say like, oh, milk came in last night. It's going to be good this morning. And they get themselves a glass of milk and they take one sip. It's sour. And to me, that was like such a universal human experience, right? A sip of sour milk or a sniff of it. It's like, so, we all recoil. And that to me told me about what it was actually like for them to live there, where there were also power failures and water shortages and all kinds of problems because the place was growing so fast. So I was really doing the research, looking for that human part, and then looking for the hearts of this young man and this young woman who fall in love and very quickly find themselves way, way over their heads in an issue so large, we're still not settled about it 75 years later.
So one of the questions was if there are a lot of documentaries of the individuals like Charlie's peers? Are there real life documentaries that you've seen or read?
There are films about the most senior leadership and some of the policymakers and decision makers, and there are not very many about the ordinary guys. And they weren't ordinary, they were all scientists and they're all very bright. But I mean that they were sort of the soldiers of this. Not a lot of documentaries. One of the things that helped a lot was that the wives of some of the senior officers and senior staffers wrote memoirs after the war, which they self-published. And I'm not generally a big reader of self-published books, but several of these women wrote very compelling stories about what it was like to live there and to not know, and after a while, to kind of have an idea and to have figured it out. And in some cases, the women were scientists also, so they could figure out exactly what was going on, but they weren't allowed to talk to their spouse about it. So there was that whole dynamic. Does that answer it? I forget the whole question.
Yeah, basically it's a research question, which leads into the other question too, is how you learned about the people who lived these lives and how you learned about the science.
So it wasn't documentaries. There's some definitive books. The Atomic Heritage Institute did a book called The Manhattan Project that's an oral history and collection of writings from people that were involved. There are these self-published memories. There's a kind of the Bible on this is called The Making of the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes. It's a masterpiece. Then there were small articles. There's something called the Atomic Archive, which has lots of information. There is a museum in Los Alamos, and its website had a lot of documents on it. One of the things that becomes clear, I've told you that Charlie, my character, was uncertain about doing this work, and that is absolutely what was going on. Many of the scientists objected to what they were building. They continued to do the work, but they filed petitions. Hundreds of them signed letters to the president saying, don't use this on people. Have a demonstration someplace in the open and let the Japanese observe it, and they will surrender. And their concerns were dismissed. But all along, there were many of them that had that hesitation. And that was borne out in a lot of the documents that I read. Petitions that they made, debates that they had. And it turns out there's a pretty good record. Interestingly enough, when I went to Los Alamos, I was able to see, the outside of the National Lab and go to a couple of the old buildings. But most of the history has been scrubbed. And I'll give you an example. No, I won't. I'll just say that there's. It's not like there's a sign. Here is where the first chain reaction took place. Here is where the plutonium was put in the detonant. There's nothing like that. There's no guide like that. There's the main hall and a couple of the cabins that the senior management lived in, and that's it. It's very different from you go to Pearl Harbor and into the memorial, and there's a USS Arizona sitting right there on the bottom in front of you. And you go to Gettysburg, you can get a guidebook. On this hill, 600 boys from Pennsylvania died in Pickett's charge. You can't find any of that sort of thing in Los Alamos. So it was more like finding all kinds of other sources. The big help for me is I have a great local library, and they also have an interlibrary loan with the millions of books at University of Vermont and Middlebury College. So I was able to tap those resources as well.
So that actually is a good lead into the next question, which is a really good question. I'm going to read the whole thing. It says, Colin McCann has sort of laid out the standard for fictionalizing actual people. How did you go about bridging that divide between actual facts and your imaginative rendering of these characters?
That's a great question, because I think there's sort of a moral obligation to readers to be really clear about what's real and what's made up. So the first thing I would say is, in fact, the acknowledgments for this book are 5 pages long, and about 3.5 of those pages are clarifying what's real and what's not real. One character I call Igor Bronsky, and the original guy was Igor Kistiakowski. And that Kistiakowski has about 27 letters in it. And I just thought there'd be a lot for a reader to get over. So I changed his name to Bronsky, but otherwise kind of similar. And so sometimes it was as simple as that. I do not have any laws of nature not followed. The calendar that I have, the scientific details, all of that stuff is accurate. I quote from some newspaper headlines and editorials after Hiroshima. Those are all verbatim quotes. The characters, though, are all made up. And my main character, Charlie, was very loosely based on this guy who worked on the detonator and then went to Stanford and quit. But really, only that level of detail. Otherwise, it's really a novel. And part of that is because real people are a lot more complicated, and most of the time, they're boring or they're just ordinary in their days. Whereas with a character, you want each moment to matter. You want each gesture, each word that they say to be part of the essential story. So I don't think I necessarily fictionalized. It was more like a challenge to say, if this Trinity test happened on this day, then their relationship has to be at this point by that day. And if Hiroshima happened on this day, they need to be at this place when that happens. And when the war ends, here's where they should be when they find out. It was more like that. It was more like making the story conform to the reality that happened. You know, as I said, I wrote a book about D-Day this way, and I knew that a French woman, a French farmer, would not know an 82nd Airborne Division from 101st Airborne Division, but I needed to know. So the person who was coming out of the sky had the right uniform, the right weapon, spoke the right language, was supposed to be in that place geographically. Like, that's the homework I do, so that to the reader it is seamless. Because the reader doesn't necessarily probably know 82nd from 101st either. And so it's about the verisimilitude and making the fiction conform to the reality of the facts. You can't have Abraham Lincoln shot in the morning. He was at a theater at night, right? So you can build your narrative around that horrific event, understanding the laws of history. And I think you really have to be very careful about it, because films often will change the sequence of things happen or what someone said or did. And somehow, maybe because it's ephemeral, the film goes on, they don't get quite held accountable the same way. But I promise you, if I get a fact wrong, I learned this, I don't know, about 4 books ago, plenty of readers will not be shy at all about drawing that to my attention.
So I have a question, and it's one of my favorite questions when people are in the audience, is that when you're not doing research, what do you read for pleasure?
Oh, I read, north of 100 books a year. I try to read 150. And,
Fiction, nonfiction?
uh, I would say I probably read 30 books of poetry a year. 25 anyway, but probably 30. And I probably read 20 or 25 books of nonfiction, and then all the rest are fiction. And one of the things that's fun is I'm working on a new project now, and this one was held for a little while, partly to be timed to the anniversary of the bomb, and partly because of COVID. So I've had some time to get started on the next one, and this one doesn't require extensive research, and I'm having so much fun because I'm reading a bunch of stuff that's coming out right now, and it's very interesting. We're in a time where you can't go to a movie, and there's not like new production television going on, and there's not live music going on or outdoor concerts going on. And fortunately, I think the books that are coming out these days are unbelievably. They're really, really good. I've read a bunch of great books. And I've got some on my shelf that are next that I can't wait to get to. And so I'm glad that this is like a good time for the literature. And I say of the fiction that I read, about 10% is classics and about 10% is rereads. And then of the rest, probably half or more is friends. And then just whatever sounds really fascinating. I haven't met Colson Whitehead. He's not my friend, and I'm going to read every word that guy writes because Underground Railroad was unbelievable and Nickel Boys was even better. That book messed me up good for a week. It was so good. And so, so he's not a friend, but he's a contemporary writer whose work I very, very much admire. And so that's sort of the split. But I'm reading every day. And the trick I have is, first of all, I don't own television. I never have. And so any minute that somebody else is spending television, I'm probably reading. And also, I don't save my reading for bedtime. I read other times of the day and at bedtime, but other times of the day. And it's amazing how much, when you're wide awake, how much you can read in half an hour or an hour.
Not the same 2 pages every night.
Exactly. Who was this character again? That's right.
So
Ishmael, who's he?
Somebody just asked what motivated you to be a writer, and do you prefer being a journalist or a writer, and why?
I have always been a storyteller since I was a little kid. So I wasn't necessarily thinking writer, it just was my way. I was a storyteller. And I remember being like in camp when I was 13 and making up ghost stories by the campfire. Like I've always been a storyteller. And I loved being a newspaper journalist. I did it for 20 years, and then I did 2 books of journalism. And I still do the occasional magazine piece and so on. I still like doing that. Someday I would love to write a biography. But here's the thing, I wrote editorials, for example, for 14 years. This is between 750 and 1,000 words of an opinion on something. And, I got so that pretty much I knew where I needed to be by sentence 4, if that editorial was going to work, right? I'd written the form so many times. But some ideas are bigger than 1,000 words. In fact, some ideas take 100,000 words. And sometimes the only way we can understand them is in story. And the way that we will remember them is not with the facts, but if they touch our heart. And it's a whole different way of communicating with people. And yeah, I'll tell this story. Sure. So my first novel was A Curiosity. And it's about a woman who, among other things, it's about a woman who works with one of the top cell research labs in the world, and they're unethical. And she ends up quitting and becoming a high school biology teacher and is completely fulfilled by that trajectory. That's like a happy ending for her. And again, there's a lot of other things in the book, but there's that. So if you just tuck that away. So when I was a reporter, let's say the governor announces he's got a new transportation secretary, and I go to the news conference and I'm taking notes, and I'm thinking, this governor, I don't know, the cabinet choices aren't great, whatever. I've got a remove from him, And then I go back to the office and here's the new transportation secretary, and I call the environmentalists, and they say, that guy, he wants to pave the state. He is no good. Okay, and I've got to remove from them, and I take those notes. I call the paving industry. They say, this guy is a champion, and he loves Vermont, and he just wants to create jobs, and he's a great guy, and I have a distance from that. And I write my story about this announcement. And then my editor reads it, the city editor reads it, and he's got to remove from me. He didn't talk or listen to any of these people. And he says, check this fact, and let's take this out, and this is controversial. We better show it to the managing editor. 2 degrees away from, right? The point is, by the time the story is in the newspaper the next morning, the reader picks it up and says, oh, Kiernan, he doesn't like paving. And so there's like all these removes. And with fiction, it's absolutely the opposite. People sit down, they open this thing, and if it's any good, pretty soon they forget it's a book. They forget it's black marks on a white page. They forget the author. They forget the title. There's just this movie that's happening in their imagination, and they're actually creating it. Galway Kinnell, who was Vermont Poets Laureate, used to say, the book is only half the transaction. The other half is in the reader's head. No remove. So there I am at my first event for The Curiosity, and I'm about to speak about a novel for the first time in my life, and it's in front of 700 people. And I'm terrified. And I'm standing off to the side while the event before me is wrapping up. It's at the annual meeting of the American Library Association. It's 20,000 librarians in this one huge convention center in Chicago. And while I'm standing off to the side, just kind of sipping water nervously, this guy walks up to me, this young man walks up to me and says, are you Stephen Kiernan? I said, yes, I am. And he said, well, I read an early edition of your book. And you know what I think? And I said, what? He said, I love you. And he threw his arms around me and just about picked me up in the air. I was like, I love you too, man. What's your name? His name is Josh. Josh says, I wish my father was still alive. I want to give him your book. And I say, why is that? And he says, because it tells my life story. I said, it's about a woman who becomes a biology teacher. He says, oh, that, yeah, I know. But it's actually about, like, he would understand, if he read this, he would understand why I left law school to become a librarian. So, like, my point is that what happens for the reader in fiction is so much richer because they're not removed from it. They are creating it. They are co-creating it. And that is an incredible privilege. And I love connecting with people that way. I enjoyed and kind of got a thrill from the journalism side of things and finding the fact. But that hug from Josh was like nothing I ever got from a newspaper reader. That was somebody whose heart had been touched. Whole different kind of experience. It's why, though I will continue to write journalistic pieces, I want to write novels to the day I die. I mean, literally, I want my last act to be typing the end, print, new novel done, gone. You know, just I want to tell stories right to the finish line.
Okay. So was there another story that you had us take a vote on what
Sure.
this was?
Sure. Let's see. The next choice is, where's my list of choices? Let's see. We could do mattresses or Fuller Lodge. Mattresses or Fuller Lodge? No votes? I promise, yes, I will read. Mattresses, I will read from the book, I promise. Hi, Maria. Thanks for being there.
Mattresses, mattresses, 1 lodge, 2 lodge, 4 mattresses. Looks like mattresses 1.
Okay. So again, it's just to tell you that we have this idea of these geniuses. This is in the sour milk category. We have this idea of these geniuses and their incredible mental capacity. But there is also the stereotype of the absent-minded scientist, right? Because they're so caught up in the things they're trying to sort out that they forget practicalities. So there's that steel tower I told you about. And they bring the bomb out there, and it has been assembled, and it has been made live. And there's wiring to go on, but like the plutonium is inside, okay? And the thing weighs 10,800 pounds. And they hook there's a ring on the top, and it's a gigantic spear. It's maybe 10 feet around, 8 feet around. And they run a hook through a loop there, and they have a crane up above, and they start to pull the thing up off the ground. And it gets about 6 feet up, and the tops of the tower start to bend in. And the army guy says, can't this thing hold the weight of it? And they say, you told us to build it for 9,000 pounds. They said, well, it's 11,000. It's 10,800. They said, well, it'll probably be okay. And the captain, or I can't remember if it was I think it was a captain was in charge, said, well, what if we drop it? And they said, goodbye. So he sent his guys, his privates, with a truck, and they went back to the barracks for all the army guys and took all of their thin little cot mattresses and brought them out and piled them up till they were about 8 feet high. And then they cranked the thing the rest of the way up with everyone just standing there and saying, like, don't come down on us, don't come down on us. And it didn't. And then they took, and when they were all done, they asked one of the physicists, would those mattresses have made any differences at all? And he said, not a bit. It would have fallen and blown up right on us here. So they thought that they had everything very polished, but they could have blown themselves up really easily. I'm seeing a lot of requests for reading. Should I do that? Should I skip my slideshow and do that?
Sure.
What do you think, Liza? Or should I do the slideshow for a minute? What do you think? How about if I read? I'm just going to read a page, okay? I'm going to read the opening page because this opening page actually tells you the entire story and lets you get to know Brenda. She's the first narrator. So this is how Universe of Two opens. I met Charlie Fish in Chicago in the fall of 1943. First, I dismissed him. Then I liked him. Then I ruined him. Then I saved him. In return, he taught me what love was, lust too, and above all, what it is like to have a powerful conscience. On first impression, Charlie was weak-chinned. To my girlfriends, I might have called him a milquetoast, soft as an old banana, which only goes to show how smart a 19-year-old girl is about anything. Now I know better. It turns out the greatest kinds of strength are hidden and move slowly and cannot be stopped by anything until they have changed the world, which he did twice. I'm not exaggerating. I was there on both occasions. One time I helped him, the other time I hurt him. I hadn't intended any harm, but there's no denying that I used my influence to make him do terrible things, irreversible things. He forgave me. That was in his nature. But I haven't forgiven myself even now, all these many years later. Some deeds are like tattoos, and the ink of regret is permanent. How did it start? As innocently as the chiming of a bell when a shop door opens. I was in the back office when I heard it ring, letting me know a customer had come in.
We could all sit here and listen to you read for another hour, I think, Stephen. That was,
Well,
was
thanks.
great.
I love reading, and in fact, I read aloud several times. I read drafts aloud as part of my rewriting.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, maybe it's the bedtime stories with my kids of once upon a time.
Wow. Wow. So are there other questions, or are we ready to wrap? I guess somebody said great first page, and I don't disagree. That was
Thank you.
wonderful.
Thank you.
So I guess we will wrap up. Thank you. It was wonderful, and we encourage those of you who have joined us to purchase the books and finish the story. I forgot to mention that Stephen has kindly mailed us signed book plates. So if you're interested in getting your, if you can see it, getting one for your book, just let us know when you place your order. Be sure to mark your calendars. Margot Livesey on the 18th, and David McCauley first next week on the 13th, and lots more in the planning stages. Stay tuned. Join our newsletter. We always send out information how to get links. And Stephen, put us on your calendar for your next book.
Absolutely, wouldn't miss it. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Really, really great of you to take part. Thanks for playing a little game with me. And I hope you'll take a look at Universe of Two and let me know what you think about it. Okay, I'm all over social media. I'm easy to find, and I'd love to hear back from you. Thank you so much for having me, Liza, and to all of you for coming tonight.
Thank you all. So we look forward to the next one.
Good deal.
First, we enjoy this one.
Okay. Good night.
Good night.